The first light of morning. A poor boy's new beginning. It was 5 in the morning. The entire city was still asleep. The streets were quiet. Store doors were closed, and the sky had not completely surrendered the night. But in a small neighborhood on the edge of Chicago, a 16-year-old boy named Ethan Parker was already awake. He had no expensive clothes, no smartphone, and no wealthy family behind him. He had an old-school backpack, 2 changes of clothes, and a dream he was almost afraid to say out loud. Every morning, Ethan delivered newspapers to homes around his neighborhood before heading to school. But that morning was different. He picked up his stack of newspapers, opened the front door, and looked toward the eastern sky. It was still dark. Then a thin line of golden light appeared beyond the clouds. Ethan stopped walking and whispered, "Maybe a new morning isn't only for people who already have everything." He had no idea that those words would become the beginning of a completely different life. Ethan lived in a small apartment with his mother, Sarah. His father had passed away several years earlier, leaving Sarah to carry the responsibility of raising her son alone. She cleaned houses during the day and sometimes worked extra hours just to keep the rent paid. Some nights there was a proper dinner. Other nights, dinner was simply toast and tea. But Sarah had always taught Ethan one thing: being poor is nothing to be ashamed of. Giving up on yourself is. Ethan believed her, but sometimes he still wondered whether determination could really change a person's life. At school, other students wore new sneakers, carried expensive phones, and arrived in cars driven by their parents. Ethan arrived after delivering newspapers, usually tired and sometimes still thinking about the work waiting for him after school. He attended classes during the day and worked evenings at a small neighborhood grocery store. His hands were often tired. His eyes were often heavy with sleep. But whenever he opened a book, he forced himself to keep going because he had begun to believe that if he didn't have money, education could become his opportunity. One morning, his teacher, Mr. Reynolds, asked the class, "What do you want to become when you grow up?" Students gave answers like doctors, engineers, lawyers, and business owners. When it was Ethan's turn, the room became quiet. Mr. Reynolds asked, "Ethan, what do you want to become?" Ethan paused before answering, "I want to become someone who never has to watch his mother worry about money again." A few students laughed. Mr. Reynolds didn't. He simply looked at Ethan and said, "Remember that answer." From that day forward, Ethan took his studies more seriously than ever. But life doesn't always become easier just because someone decides to work hard. One evening, the rent was due, and there wasn't enough money in the apartment. Sarah opened her purse and counted the few bills she had left. Ethan understood immediately. "Mom, you can pay the rent first. I'll take care of my school expenses next month." Sarah shook her head. "No, Ethan, your education comes first." Ethan smiled gently. "Mom, 1 month won't kill a dream." Sarah looked away because she didn't want him to see the tears in her eyes. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He would work extra hours after school. He would give up some free time. He would spend less time hanging out with friends and more time preparing for his future. Months passed. One afternoon, Ethan discovered an old computer sitting in a storage room at school. The monitor had scratches across it, several keyboard keys were missing, and nobody seemed to want it. Ethan asked the school custodian, "Is this computer being used?" The custodian laughed. "That thing? It doesn't work. It's basically trash." Ethan asked, "If I can fix it, can I have it?" The custodian shrugged. "Sure." Ethan carried the old computer home. Sarah looked at it and smiled. "What are you going to do with that?" Ethan replied. "Maybe this can become my new textbook." He didn't know much about computers, but he started learning. He borrowed books from the library, searched through old manuals, and asked his teachers questions. When something didn't make sense, he studied it again. Sometimes the computer shut down. Sometimes the power went out. Sometimes he lost hours of work. But the next morning, he started again. One afternoon, a friend asked him, "Why are you working this hard? Do you really think someone from our neighborhood can build a big future?" Ethan smiled. "I don't know, but if I don't try, I'll never know." That became one of the most important beliefs of his life. Ethan didn't need a guarantee that he would succeed. He only needed a reason to keep trying. Eventually, exam season arrived. Ethan studied before school, worked after school, and reviewed his notes late into the night. Then the results were announced. Ethan had earned the highest grades in his school. Mr. Reynolds called him to the front of the classroom and said, "Ethan, you didn't just pass an exam, you proved that circumstances don't get to decide your destination." Ethan stood there quietly, trying not to cry. But his biggest challenge was still ahead. He had an opportunity to apply for a scholarship that could pay for his higher education. If he earned it, his future could change. If he failed, he might have to leave school and work full-time. On the morning of the scholarship exam, a heavy storm moved through the city. Ethan didn't have enough money for a ride, so he left home early and walked. Rain soaked his clothes. His shoes became covered in mud. But he kept walking. When he finally reached the testing center, he was exhausted and breathing heavily. An administrator standing near the entrance noticed him. "Are you here for the scholarship exam?" he asked. Ethan nodded. The man smiled. "Then get inside. You still have time." Ethan took the exam. A few weeks later, the results arrived. He had been selected. Ethan received the scholarship. When he told his mother, Sarah stood completely still for several seconds. Then she hugged him tightly. "I always told you," she whispered. "Being poor isn't something to be ashamed of." Ethan smiled. "And you also taught me that morning always comes after night." Years passed. Ethan completed his education and eventually started a small technology company. In the beginning, the company was nothing more than one desk, an old computer, and an idea. There were setbacks. There were months when the business nearly failed. People doubted him. Some told him, "You're dreaming too big." But Ethan remembered the newspaper route, the broken computer, the rainy morning, and that first line of sunlight he had seen at 16. Whenever something went wrong, he asked himself one question: am I one step farther than I was yesterday? If the answer was yes, he continued. Eventually, the company became successful, but Ethan never forgot where he came from. He opened a small community learning center in his old neighborhood, where children from low-income families could study for free, use computers, and receive help with their education. One afternoon, a young boy walked into the center. His clothes were worn, and his sneakers were falling apart. He stood in front of Ethan and asked, "Can kids like me really have big dreams?" Ethan looked at him for a moment and smiled. "You don't need a rich family to have a big dream. You need courage to keep working toward it." The boy asked, "What if the road is too difficult?" Ethan looked through the window at the evening sky and answered, "Then wait for the morning, but keep moving toward it." The boy smiled, and Ethan realized that the lesson his mother had given him years ago was now being passed to someone else. Maybe that was the real meaning of success. It wasn't simply escaping poverty, it was becoming the person who could give someone else hope. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson in Ethan's story. If your life is difficult right now, that doesn't mean your story is over. Maybe you're simply living through the chapter where everything feels uncertain. Maybe you don't have enough money. Maybe opportunities seem limited. Maybe people don't believe in you. But remember this: a new morning always brings another opportunity to begin. You don't have to change your entire life in one day. You only need to take the next step, then another, then another. One day, you'll look back and wonder how you made it so far. The truth is, you didn't do it all at once. You did it on every morning when you could have given up but chose to try again. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who may need a little hope today. And if you enjoy meaningful stories about ordinary people overcoming extraordinary circumstances, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. In the comments, write one sentence: My new morning starts today. Maybe those 4 words will give someone else the courage to keep going. Remember, your current situation is not your final destination. Night can last for hours, but it can never stop the morning from coming. And maybe your new morning is already beginning.